Deep in the Sahara Desert, 1,000 kilometers from the sea, a single stone column stands above the sand. Around it lie the bones of a city, walls worn soft by wind, streets that lead nowhere now. And beneath it all, stretching for hundreds of kilometers in the darkness, a network of tunnels dug by human hands, tunnels that once carried water through the driest place on earth. For more than 1,000 years, a kingdom flourished here. Its people grew wheat and dates where nothing should grow. They traded with Rome. They built pyramids for their dead. The Greeks wrote about them. The Romans marched against them. And then, quietly, slowly, they vanished. Not in fire, not in war. They simply faded from the world, until even their name was almost forgotten. Tonight, we're going to travel into the heart of the great desert, to the lost kingdom of the Garamantes. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let the sand and the centuries drift past. This is the story of the civilization that made the Sahara bloom, and of the ancient water that made it possible. To understand the Garamantes, we have to begin long before them, in a Sahara you would not recognize. Close your eyes and picture the desert as it was 12,000 years ago. There are no endless dunes. Instead, there is grass bending in the wind. There are lakes so wide their far shores disappear into haze. Rivers move slowly across the land, and along their banks, acacia trees cast pools of shade. Hippos wallow in the shallows. Crocodiles drift like logs. Herds of elephants and giraffes wander a savanna that stretches for thousands of kilometers across what is now the driest great desert on Earth. Scientists call this the African humid period. A slow wobble in the Earth's orbit had shifted the rains northward, and for thousands of years, the monsoon reached deep into the Sahara. Where today there is only sand and stone, there was once a green world, and people lived in it. We know this because they left us pictures. In the far southwest of Libya, there is a mountain range called the Tadrart Acacus. Its canyons are dry now, silent, painted in shades of rust and shadow. But on the walls of its caves and overhangs, ancient hands left thousands of images. Herders walking beside long-horned cattle, hunters with bows, dancers, swimmers. Families gathered together, rendered in ochre and white, 10,000 years old and more. These paintings are a memory the desert keeps, a record of the green Sahara made by the people who knew it, painted in the very places where their descendants would one day build a kingdom. But the green world was not permanent. It never is. Around 6,000 years ago, the Earth's slow wobble carried the rains away again. Year by year, generation by generation, the monsoon retreated south. The change was not sudden. No single lifetime saw the whole of it. But the lakes began to shrink, leaving rings of salt. The rivers ran thinner each spring. The grass gave way to scrub, and the scrub gave way to sand. The animals drifted south, following the water. And the people had a choice to make. Some followed the herds toward the lands we now call the Sahel. Others turned north toward the Mediterranean coast. But some stayed. They gathered in the places where water lingered longest. The low valleys, the oases, the beds of dying rivers. One of those places was a long, narrow valley in the region called the Fezzan, in what is now southwestern Libya. The valley is called the Wadi al-Ajal. It runs for roughly 150 kilometers, pinned between two walls of the desert. To the north, a vast gravel plateau, dark and flat as an anvil. To the south, the golden dunes of a great sand sea, rising like a frozen tide. And in between, a corridor of life. Here is the secret of everything that follows. When the rains fell on the green Sahara, all those thousands of years, not all of that water ran to the sea or rose back into the sky. Some of it sank. Drop by drop, it filtered down through sand and stone, gathering in deep layers of porous rock. Slowly, patiently, it filled the darkness beneath the desert. Geologists call it fossil water, rain that fell 10,000 years ago and more, sealed away beneath the earth, a hidden inheritance from a greener age. The people of the Wadi al-Ajal could not see it. They had no maps of what lay below, but they knew that in certain places, water seeped from the ground. They knew that date palms grew where nothing else would. And over the centuries, as the surface world grew harder and drier, they learned to live closer and closer to that buried gift. Archaeologists have traced their story through the layers. First, camps of herders at the valley's springs, then villages of stone and mud brick on the hillsides, fields, small at first, cemeteries that grew larger with each generation, watching over the valley from the slopes. By around 3,000 years ago, the scattered peoples of the Wadi were becoming something more, something the Sahara had never seen before. They were becoming a nation in the emptiest place on earth. The desert around them went on dying. Beyond the valley walls, the last grasslands surrendered to the sand, and the Sahara became the barrier we know today. A sea of light and silence, wider than the United States, hostile to almost every living thing. But down in the Wadi al-Ajal, shaded by palms, a people was quietly gathering its strength. The Greeks would come to know their name, the Romans would come to fear it, and then to trade upon it. They were the Garamantes, and beneath their feet, in the cool dark, the ancient rain was waiting. Every kingdom begins somewhere. For the Garamantes, it began where the water was. By around 900 BC, the villages of the Wadi al-Ajal were growing into towns, and at the heart of the valley, one settlement began to rise above the rest. The Garamantes called it Garama. Today, its ruins lie beside the modern village of Garama, and for 1,000 years, it was the capital of the Sahara. Picture it at its height, in the late afternoon light. Walls of mud brick, tawny and warm, catching the low sun. Watchtowers at the corners. Inside the walls, a maze of houses pressed close together, their rooms cool and dim, their doorways hung with cloth. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Somewhere, a donkey complains. Water murmurs in a channel beside the street. At the center of town stand buildings of dressed stone, a temple with a columned porch and broad steps, where the important business of gods and kings was carried out. Archaeologists who excavated old Garama found a true city, not a camp. Stone foundations for the elite, mud brick homes for everyone else, with hearths and courtyards and wells, workshops, markets. Excavations suggest the capital held around 4,000 people, with thousands more in the villages and farms nearby, and tens of thousands across the valley as a whole. In the heart of the world's harshest desert, that is an astonishing number. Every one of those lives depended on water that had to be found, carried, and defended. The wider world first wrote the Garamantes' name in the 5th century BC. The Greek historian Herodotus, gathering stories of distant lands, described them as an exceedingly numerous people of the deep desert, a people who farmed and herded cattle and rode to war in chariots drawn by 4 horses. For a long time, scholars smiled at that. Chariots? In the Sahara? It sounded like a traveler's tale. Then, archaeologists began to look closely at the rock art of the Fazan and the mountains around it. And there they were, chariots, painted and carved, wheels spinning at full gallop across the stone. The desert had kept the evidence all along. The Garamantes were not an empire of marble and legions. Their power was quieter, and in its way, more remarkable. They were a confederation of desert peoples, bound together under kings who ruled from Garama. From the valley, their influence reached out across the sand, east toward the oases, on the road to Egypt, south toward the lands beyond the desert, north toward the Mediterranean world. They stood at the crossroads of the Sahara, and they made the crossroads pay. Caravans moved under their protection and under their tax. Salt and semi-precious stones, gold and ivory, cloth and glass and wine. And, we must say it plainly, human beings. For the Garamantes, like most powers of the ancient world, traded in slaves, and captive labor helped build what they built. Their kingdom was a marvel. It was not innocent. Few kingdoms are. They had writing too. Across the Fazan, on rocks and tomb walls, they left inscriptions in an ancient script, spare, geometric letters that scholars call Libico-Berber. Its descendants survive among the Tuareg people to this day. Most of the ancient inscriptions, though, still keep their secrets. We can name the letters. We cannot always read the words. A kingdom that speaks to us, in a voice we can only half understand. And then there are the dead. Along the edges of the Wadi al-Ajal, where the valley floor meets the slopes, the Garamantes buried their ancestors. Not in dozens of graves, not in hundreds. Archaeological surveys have mapped tens of thousands of tombs along the valley. Cairns and drum-shaped monuments, stepped platforms, and small, sharp pyramids of mud brick standing in rows against the desert. Whole cities of the dead, watching over the cities of the living. Some tombs held offerings of Roman glass and fine pottery. Some held amphorae that once carried wine from vineyards on the far side of the sea. Even in death, the Garamantes kept their connections to the wide world. And their tombs still stand today, eroding slowly, keeping their long watch as the dunes advance. By the time Rome was rising far to the north, the Garamantes were already old. They had their capital and their kings, their script, their gods, their trade roads, and their chariots. They had turned a dying valley into the center of a desert world. But everything, the city, the caravans, the tombs, the kingdom itself, all of it rested on a single foundation. Not gold, not armies. Water. And the story of how the Garamantes found their water and spent it is the story of their glory and of their end. Before we descend into the tunnels, though, the kingdom must first survive its greatest test. Because far away, on the shores of the Mediterranean, a new power was turning its gaze toward the desert. Rome was coming. To the Romans, the world had edges, and the Garamantes lived beyond them. When Rome took the coast of North Africa, it inherited rich port cities and fertile plains, and it inherited rumors. Rumors of a kingdom far to the south, out past the gravel wastes, where the maps dissolved into stories. Roman writers filled that emptiness with wonders, serpents in swarms, fountains that ran cold by day and hot by night, men without heads and men without voices. Somewhere beneath the legends, though, was something real. Caravans came north out of the desert carrying ivory and precious stones. And raiders came north out of the desert too, striking at farms and wells along the frontier. To Rome, the Garamantes were both, a trading partner in the shadows and a threat. In the year 20 BC, Rome decided to answer the threat. The governor of Africa was a man named Lucius Cornelius Balbus. Ambitious, meticulous, and born not in Italy but in Spain, which mattered in Rome and made him hungry to prove himself. Balbus prepared his desert war like an engineer. Roman writers tell us he gathered maps and intelligence, and secured the desert wells along his route. He assembled a force of around 10,000 men at the coastal city of Sabratha, and then he marched them south, off the edge of the Roman map. Imagine that march for a moment. Column after column of soldiers, wading through heat that shimmers like water. The gravel plains stretching flat to every horizon. Nights, suddenly, shockingly cold, the stars burning overhead in numbers no Italian sky ever showed them. They took the oasis of Gadames. They pressed on, hundreds of kilometers more, through country that killed the careless. And at last, they came down into the Wadi al-Ajal and took Garama itself, along with, Roman sources claim, more than a dozen towns of the Garamantian realm. In Rome, Balbus was granted a triumph, the parade of a conquering hero, riding a chariot through the roaring streets, his face painted red like the god Jupiter. He was the first man born outside Italy ever to receive that honor. And on the great marble list of Roman triumphs, the Fasti Triumphales, his name is the final entry. After Balbus, the stone falls silent. There is a strange poetry in that. The last name on Rome's roll of triumphs, earned in a war against a kingdom of the deep Sahara. But here is what the triumph did not say. Rome did not keep Garama. No garrison could hold a city at the end of a 1,000-kilometer supply line of sand. The legions marched home, and the Garamantes endured. For a century, the relationship smoldered. Garamantian fighters joined rebellions against Rome. Roman columns marched south in reprisal, in the year 70 AD, and again in the 80s. Each time, the desert absorbed the blow. You cannot occupy an ocean, and slowly, both sides arrived at the same quiet conclusion. There was more profit in peace. So the swords were set aside, and the caravans grew longer. From the north came the good things of the Mediterranean, wine and olive oil in tall clay amphorae, glassware that glowed like captured water, fine red pottery, coins, cloth. Archaeologists have found all of it in the ruins and tombs of the Fazan. Roman luxuries, carried week after week across the dunes to grace desert tables. From the south, through Garamantian hands, came the wealth of inner Africa, ivory, gold, salt from the desert's own body, wild beasts destined for Roman arenas. And enslaved people marched north in numbers history never counted, the trade's darkest cargo, and one of its most profitable. The kingdom's golden age, we should remember, was gilded at a terrible human price. Garama itself began to change. Its kings, grown rich on the caravan tolls, rebuilt their capital with Mediterranean airs. Buildings of dressed stone rose among the mud brick, among them a structure so Roman in its manner that its column still stands today, far out in the sand, like a visitor who never went home. A Roman traveler named Julius Maternus even journeyed south from Garama in the company of the Garamantian king himself, months deep into inner Africa, farther than any Roman had gone before. The kingdom Rome could not conquer had become Rome's window into a continent. Picture the valley in those years. At the height of the peace, a caravan arrives at evening, bells swaying, camels groaning down to their knees in the dust outside the walls. Torchlight. The smell of dates and wood smoke. A merchant from the coast drinks Italian wine under a Saharan sky, while the king's officials count bales by lamplight. The Garamantes had faced the greatest empire in the world, and had ended up its business partner. They must have felt, in those lamplit evenings, that their kingdom would last forever. The tombs of their ancestors lined the valley. The caravans paid. The gardens were green. But the gardens were the secret. All of it. The trade, the kings, the peace with Rome. Every date palm and every full granary depended on something no treaty could guarantee. It is time to go underground, into the tunnels that made the desert bloom. Every civilization has a secret engine. For Egypt, it was the flooding Nile. For Rome, the grain ships of the Mediterranean. For the Garamantes, it was a tunnel in the dark. They called the system by a word that survives in the desert to this day, the foggara. Here is how it worked, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is one of the quiet wonders of the ancient world. At the foot of the escarpment, where the plateau meets the valley, the water table lay hidden in the rock. The fossil water, the ancient rain. The Garamantes sank a mother well down to reach it. Then, from the fields far below in the valley, they began to dig a tunnel back toward that well, sloping ever so gently upward, meter by meter through the dark earth. When tunnel met well, the water did the rest. It flowed by gravity alone. No pumps, no wheels, no effort. Trickling cool and steady out of the tunnel mouth and into the channels of the gardens. Day and night, summer and winter. A spring built by hand that never rested. And every dozen meters or so along each tunnel, they sank a vertical shaft to the surface for hauling out spoil, for air, for access. Seen from above, the shafts march across the desert in long dotted lines, like stitching in the land, line after line after line of them. Because the Garamantes did not dig one foggara, archaeologists surveying the valley have mapped hundreds of them, and laid end to end, the tunnels run for hundreds of kilometers. Some scholars put the figure near 1,000 kilometers of hand-dug passages beneath the Sahara. Think of that. A people without iron machines, without explosives, carved a network of underground rivers longer than many of the world's real rivers. In total darkness, in the driest place on Earth, we should be honest about the hands that did the digging. The work was brutal, cramped, airless, dangerous. And scholars believe much of it fell to enslaved laborers, captives brought from the lands south of the desert. The evidence is indirect, but the logic of the kingdom points that way. The Foggaras were a marvel of engineering. They were also, in all likelihood, monuments of bondage. Both things are true, and the desert holds them together. Now come up out of the dark, into the light the tunnels made possible. Where the water emerged, the Garamantes built gardens, and the gardens were astonishing. Botanists studying ancient seeds from the ruins have found wheat and barley, date palms, and grapevines, olives, figs, and more. Crops of the Mediterranean and crops of the oasis, growing side by side in the deep Sahara. The fields were laid out in neat plots, veined with little channels. Opening a gate of packed earth sent the water sliding down a new row. A farmer could irrigate with his bare hands and a hoe. Above the grain, the date palms rose in their thousands, and their shade made a second, gentler climate beneath them, where vines and vegetables could live. Green, in a world of gold and gray. Travelers must have seen the valley from the dunes and doubted their eyes. Let us walk through one day there, at the kingdom's height. Imagine a farming family in a village near Garama. We will imagine them, because no record names them, but the ruins of their houses are real. Before dawn, the father is already at the tunnel mouth, listening. The sound of the water tells him everything, strong today, steady. His daughter guides the flow into the family's plot, breaking the little earthen dams with her heel, watching the dark stains spread between the barley rows. The air smells of wet dust, the oldest perfume in the world. At midday, the family rests in the blue shade of the palms, while the heat stands over the valley like a wall. The mother sorts dates on a woven mat. An ox turns at a well, drawing water for the household jars. Somewhere down the lane, a neighbor is singing. And in the evening, when the light turns to honey and the escarpment glows like an ember, the whole valley murmurs with water. Hundreds of tunnel mouths, all whispering at once. It could feed tens of thousands. It could pay for kings and buy Roman glass. It ran without fail, generation after generation, for hundreds of years. And so it must have seemed eternal, as reliable as sunrise, a covenant between the Garamantes and the earth itself. But remember what the water was. It was not rain. No rain worth measuring had fallen on the Fazan in a very long time. Every cup that flowed from the tunnels was fossil water, the rain of the green Sahara, 10,000 years old and more, drawn from a reservoir that nothing was refilling. The Garamantes could not have known. They had no way to see the whole of what lay below, no way to measure the level falling, slowly, in the darkness under their feet. Every garden they planted, every field they widened, every new tunnel they drove into the rock, it all drew down the inheritance a little faster. They were not farming the desert, not really. They were mining it, and every mine, someday, runs out. How does a kingdom end? We imagine fire. Armies at the gates, smoke over the walls, a last battle remembered in sorrowful songs. But the Garamantes did not end that way. Their ending was quieter. So quiet that no one, perhaps, could have named the day it began. It began in the dark, where no one could see it. Somewhere beneath the valley, after centuries of flowing, the ancient water began to fail. Not all at once. A tunnel here gave a little less each year. A mother well, there had to be deepened, and deepened again. The people responded the only way they could. They dug deeper shafts. Longer tunnels, reaching farther back under the plateau, chasing a water table that was slowly sinking away from them like a tide going out, a tide that would never come back in. For a while, skill and labor could hide the truth, but every meter deeper was harder won, and the harder the Foggaras were to maintain, the more hands the digging demanded, at the very moment in history when those hands were becoming harder to find. Because the other pillar of the kingdom was crumbling too, far away beyond the desert. Rome, the great customer, was failing. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the empire staggered under invasion and division. The rich coastal cities of North Africa changed hands and dimmed. And when the coast grew poor, the caravans grew thin. Fewer amphorae of wine came south. Fewer buyers waited for ivory and gold. The tolls that had gilded Garama dwindled year by year. Scholars, piecing the story together, see these threads twisting into one rope. The water sinking, the trade shrinking. And, many researchers suspect, the supply of enslaved labor that maintained the tunnels drying up along with the commerce that had supplied it. We should be careful here. The evidence is partial, and the causes are still debated. But the shape of the thing is clear in the ground. The engine of the kingdom was seizing, one turn at a time. Walk the valley in those late centuries, and you would have seen it if you knew where to look. A garden at the valley's edge, gone brown, its channels full of drifting sand. A village where half the houses stand open to the sky. The families moved closer to the wells that still ran. Fields pulling inward, season by season, like a hand slowly closing. The desert did not invade. It simply accepted what was surrendered. There was no panic in it. A farmer lived and died, and the valley was a little smaller at his death than at his birth. His son lived and died, and it was smaller again. Each generation inherited a slightly diminished world, and called that world normal. The kingdom did not fall silent all at once. Chroniclers record that Garama converted to Christianity in the year 569, a desert court, at the end of an age, joining the faith of the Mediterranean world it had traded with for so long. And then, in the middle of the 7th century, a new power came riding out of the east. The armies of Islam swept along the coast of North Africa, and in the 660s, an Arab force turned south, crossed the wastes, and reached the Wadi al-Ajal. What they found was not the proud capital of the caravan kings. It was a town grown small inside old walls. Its gardens shrunken, many of its tunnels dry. There was still a king at Garama when the Arabs came. He submitted. And with that quiet submission, after some 15 centuries, the kingdom of the Garamantes passed out of history. No burning, no massacre that we know of. The valley was not emptied. People went on living there, as they still do today. They tended the palms that remained, drew water from simple wells, said new prayers in a new tongue. But the Foggaras, the great engine, needed a kingdom to maintain them, and the kingdom was gone. One by one, the last tunnels silted and slumped and stopped. The whisper of water that had filled the valley for 1,000 years faded, tunnel mouth by tunnel mouth, until it was gone. And then came the strangest chapter of all, the forgetting. The name of the Garamantes survived in the old books, in Herodotus and the Roman geographers, copied by scholars who had no idea whether such a people had ever truly lived. In the valley itself, the memory washed away like a channel in the sand. Centuries later, the people of the Fezzan would look at the endless lines of shafts marching across their desert and say the Romans must have built them. The true builders, their own ancestors, had slipped out of memory entirely. Think of that. A nation that humbled a Roman general, that fed tens of thousands in the driest place on earth, that built 1,000 kilometers of rivers underground, forgotten, even at home. The tombs still stood, tens of thousands of them, keeping their watch along the valley. The columns still stood at Garama. The dunes leaned a little closer every century. And beneath it all, far down in the dark, what remained of the ancient reign lay still, its long work done. The kingdom was over, but the story was not, because after 1,000 years of silence, someone finally came looking. For 1,000 years, the valley kept its secret. Caravans still crossed the Fezzan in the centuries that followed, salt going one way, cloth and dates the other. Travelers passed the mounds and the strange lines of shafts and wondered idly and moved on. The desert does not explain itself, it only waits. European explorers reached the valley in the 19th century, hauling their notebooks across the dunes. They saw the little pyramids and the ruined walls, and guessed at Romans, at Egyptians, at anyone but the truth. The old books mentioned Garamantes. But surely, scholars thought, those had been mere barbarians of legend, nomads, a name on the edge of better people's maps. The desert waited a little longer. Then, in the 20th century, the diggers came, and the truth began to surface, trench by patient trench. Archaeologists excavating at Old Germa in the 1960s found not a camp, but a city, stone foundations, a temple, imported Roman glass, glittering in the dust. And from the 1990s, a British and Libyan team led by the archaeologist David Mattingly surveyed the valley end to end, walking the tomb fields, tracing the shaft lines, studying seeds and bones and potsherds. What they assembled overturned everything. The barbarians of legend had been farmers and engineers. The desert nomads had been city dwellers, with writing and kings and trade routes that touched two worlds. Aerial photographs revealed the foggara lines by the hundreds, stitched across the valley floor, and the tombs, counted at last, ran into the tens of thousands. Piece by piece, the Garamantes came back from the dead, not as a myth, but as a mirror. A civilization as real and as inventive, and as fragile as any that ever raised a wall. And their story, it turns out, was not only about the past. Today, all around the world, nations draw water from deep fossil aquifers, ancient reserves, filled in wetter ages, that refill slowly or not at all. Great pumps do now what the Foggaras did then, on a scale the Garamantes could never have dreamed. The kingdom of the Wadi al-Ajal was simply the first to live entirely on the water of a vanished climate. The first to learn, without ever quite knowing it, how that story goes. They were not foolish, they were brilliant. They took a dying valley and made it bloom for 1,000 years, longer than most empires last. The lesson they leave is not a warning shouted, but something quieter, that every garden rests on something, and it is wise to know what, and to know how deep it goes. The valley is still there, of course. It was never empty. Drive the long road through the Wadi al-Ajal today, and you pass palm groves and quiet villages, children on bicycles, tea cooling in small glasses in the shade. The modern town of Garama sits beside the ruins of ancient Garama. Two settlements, 13 centuries apart, sharing the same well of shade and silence. The escarpment still glows like an ember at sunset. The sand sea still leans at the valley's southern edge, golden and patient. And out among the ruins, the lone column still stands, older than the language spoken around it, casting its thin shadow across the afternoon, as it has for nearly 2,000 years. The tomb fields stretch along the valley margins, mile after mile in the low light. Wind moves among them, and nothing else. Here and there, a small mud-brick pyramid holds its shape against the centuries, still faithful, still watching over a people whose names are gone. If you climbed the escarpment at dusk and looked down, you would see the whole story at once. The green thread of the oasis, the pale scatter of the ruins, the dotted lines of the ancient shafts running toward the hills. And over it all, as the light dies, the first stars. The same stars the Garamantes knew, wheeling slowly above the valley as they have wheeled above every kingdom that ever rose and flourished and folded itself back into the earth. The desert is very quiet now. The chariots are rock paintings. The caravans are tracks beneath the sand. The kings of Garama sleep in unmarked dust, and the empire that once marched against them is a memory too, for the desert makes no exceptions and takes no sides. But deep below the valley floor, geologists tell us some of the ancient water remains. Rain that fell on a green Sahara 10,000 years ago, resting in the darkness, as it rested before the first tunnel found it, as it may rest for 10,000 years more. The kingdom borrowed that rain for a while and built something wondrous with it and gave it back to the silence. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to remember them. Not as a mystery or a warning, but as proof of what patient hands can do, even in the emptiest place on earth. The lights of Germa are going out now, one by one, under the great wheel of stars. The valley is sleeping, and so can you. Good night.